Ambassador Keth Varan stood before the massive crystalline wall of the Galactic Council chambers. His four arms moved in precise patterns as he read through the assignment datapad for the third time. The Zilathi had served as the galaxy's primary war crimes investigator for over 2 decades. He had seen the worst that civilized species could do to each other. Nothing prepared him for what he was about to discover. The Council had received disturbing reports about human military conduct. The new species had joined the galactic community only 50 years ago. Their recent war against the hegemony raiders had ended in human victory, but at what cost? Reports suggested the humans had committed terrible acts against their prisoners. The galaxy needed to know the truth before humans gained more power in galactic politics. Keth's ship dropped out of hyperspace near New Meridian, a human colony world that had been under siege for 3 months. The planet's surface showed the scars of recent battle. Burned forests stretched for kilometers. Crater fields marked where orbital weapons had struck. The humans had won this battle, but the cost seemed enormous. The shuttle ride to the surface gave Keth his first close look at human military operations. He expected to see celebration, victory parades, or at least signs of triumph. Instead, he saw humans working alongside strange alien beings. These aliens wore the distinctive armor of hegemony raiders. Keth's translator struggled with the concept, as he realized these were prisoners helping rebuild what they had destroyed. Colonel Sarah Kim met him at the landing pad. She was a small woman by human standards, with dark hair tied back in a practical style. Her uniform showed signs of recent combat, but her manner was calm and professional. Keth had studied human behavior patterns, but their emotional control still surprised him. "Ambassador Keth Varan," she said with a slight bow. "Welcome to New Meridian. I understand you're here to investigate our conduct during the siege. I want you to know that you'll have complete access to all our records, personnel, and facilities. We have nothing to hide." This transparency immediately made Keth suspicious. In his experience, species with nothing to hide usually had the most to conceal. Every other investigation had involved careful negotiations, limited access, and constant supervision. The humans seemed almost eager to show him everything. The first stop was the temporary medical facility where both human and hegemony wounded received treatment. Keth watched human doctors working on injured raiders with the same care they showed their own people. A hegemony warrior with a severed limb received a new prosthetic from human medical technology. The alien would walk again because of human generosity. "This seems inefficient," Keth observed. "These beings were your enemies only days ago. Why waste resources on them?" Dr. Chen Wei, a human medic with gentle eyes, looked up from her patient. "They're not enemies anymore. They're patients. Our medical oath requires us to treat all injured beings equally. It doesn't matter which side they fought on." Keth made careful notes. This could be propaganda staging for his benefit. He had seen other species put on shows for investigators. But the scale of this operation suggested something more. Hundreds of hegemony prisoners received medical care, food, and shelter. The humans seemed to be spending more on prisoner care than many species spent on their own soldiers. The tour continued to the detention facilities. Keth expected to find the usual horrors of war. Instead, he discovered something that challenged every assumption he had about conflict. The hegemony prisoners lived in clean, comfortable quarters. They received 3 meals a day, medical care, and even educational programs. Some prisoners worked voluntarily in reconstruction efforts, earning small wages for their labor. A hegemony officer named Thak Moore agreed to speak with Keth privately. The 7-foot-tall reptilian warrior had commanded one of the raiding fleets that had terrorized human colonies for months. His capture should have meant execution under standard galactic military law. "The humans are strange," Thakmore said in his clicking language. "When my ship was disabled, I expected to die with honor. Instead, they rescued my crew from the wreckage. They gave us medical care and treated our wounds. I have seen many conquests, Ambassador. I have never seen conquerors who save the lives of those who tried to kill them. Keth questioned dozens of prisoners. Each told similar stories of human compassion that seemed to defy logic. Humans had saved drowning hegemony sailors during space battles. They had shared their food supplies with hungry prisoners even when their own troops went without full rations. Most disturbing of all, they had established schools where young hegemony soldiers learned trades instead of being executed as enemy combatants. That evening, Keth reviewed human military documentation in his temporary quarters. The files contained detailed records of every engagement during the siege. What he found there shook his understanding of warfare. The humans followed something called the Geneva Conventions, ancient documents that established rules for military conduct. Every human soldier carried a small book outlining these rules. The documents prohibited torture, required humane treatment of prisoners, and protected civilian populations during conflicts. More shocking still, the humans had court-martialed their own soldiers for violations of these rules. 3 human officers faced military justice for allowing enemy prisoners to be held in uncomfortable conditions for 6 hours during a transport delay. Keth had investigated war crimes across dozens of worlds. He had documented atrocities that haunted his dreams. But he had never encountered a species that punished its own soldiers for being insufficiently kind to captured enemies. The concept seemed impossible. As he prepared his preliminary notes, Keth realized that his investigation had already uncovered something unprecedented. The humans were not committing war crimes in the traditional sense. Instead, they seemed to be redefining what warfare meant. They fought with deadly efficiency when necessary, but they also maintained moral standards that no other known species had ever achieved in combat situations. The first day had shown him prisoners treated better than many citizens on some worlds. He had seen enemies turned into students, former raiders working to rebuild what they had destroyed, and medical care provided without regard to species or allegiance. If this was human warfare, it represented something entirely new in galactic history. Tomorrow, Keth would dig deeper into the siege itself. He needed to understand how these strange moral standards had affected human military effectiveness. Had their compassion made them weak? Had enemy forces taken advantage of human mercy? The answers would determine whether humans represented a threat to galactic security or something far more disturbing to the established order. Keth Varen spent his second day on New Meridian interviewing human soldiers about their combat experiences. Each conversation revealed new aspects of human military conduct that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. The soldiers spoke freely about their actions during the siege, showing none of the defensiveness he expected from beings hiding war crimes. Sergeant James Park had fought in the bloodiest battle of the siege, a 3-day urban combat operation in the colony's capital city. His unit had been surrounded by hegemony forces for 2 days, without supplies or reinforcement. Under galactic military doctrine, such circumstances justified any actions necessary for survival. "We found a group of hegemony wounded in a collapsed building," Park explained as they walked through the rebuilt city center. 8 of them, including 2, who were barely alive. My men wanted to leave them and keep moving, but our orders were clear. We called for medical evacuation and waited with them until help arrived. Keth stopped walking. "You stayed with enemy wounded while surrounded and under fire? What if the delay had cost human lives?" Park shrugged. A human gesture Keth had learned indicated casual acceptance of obvious facts. "Orders are orders. The Geneva Conventions require us to provide medical aid to all wounded, regardless of which side they fight for. Besides, they weren't enemies anymore. They were just hurt people who needed help." The investigation continued at the siege's primary battlefield, where Keth examined the physical evidence of human combat methods. Blast patterns showed that humans had used precision weapons instead of area bombardment in urban areas. Forensic analysis revealed that human forces had taken significantly higher casualties to minimize civilian deaths during street-to-street fighting. Colonel Kim provided Keth with battle recordings from soldier helmet cameras. The footage showed human troops advancing through enemy fire to evacuate civilians from combat zones. In one recording, a human squad spent 4 hours under heavy bombardment to rescue a family of hegemony non-combatants trapped in a burning building. 2 humans died in that rescue operation. This is tactically inefficient, Keth observed as they reviewed the footage. Those civilians were enemy nationals. Their rescue provided no military advantage and cost valuable human lives. Why take such risks? Kim paused the recording at a frame showing a human medic carrying a wounded hegemony child to safety. Because they're non-combatants. Our rules of engagement require the protection of all civilian populations, regardless of species or political allegiance. A child is a child. Ambassador. It doesn't matter what flag their parents serve under. That afternoon, Keth visited the battlefield memorial, where humans honored their fallen comrades. What he found there forced him to question his entire understanding of military culture. The memorial listed every human who had died during the siege, along with their actions and circumstances of death. Reading through the names, Keth discovered that over 40% of human casualties had occurred while protecting or rescuing enemy civilians and wounded. Private Lisa Chang had died holding a medical shelter against hegemony attack while doctors evacuated injured prisoners. Corporal Mike Torres had been killed while shielding a group of enemy children from artillery fire. Captain Jennifer Walsh had died defending a prisoner transport convoy against a rescue attempt by hegemony forces. These humans had died protecting the very beings who had come to destroy their world. The concept was so alien that Keth needed to verify the records multiple times. In his 2 decades of investigating warfare, he had never encountered soldiers who willingly sacrificed themselves for enemy non-combatants. The most disturbing discovery came when Keth interviewed hegemony civilians who had survived the siege. They told stories that defied every assumption about conquering forces. Human soldiers had shared their rations during food shortages. They had provided medical care for sick children and elderly civilians. Most shocking of all, they had established safe zones where hegemony families could take shelter during the worst of the fighting. An elderly hegemony female named Kresh Tal spoke to Keth through a translator device. Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through many conflicts across multiple worlds. "I have seen 7 conquests in my lifetime," she said slowly. "I have watched as soldiers of every major species took control of occupied territories. Some were cruel, others were merely indifferent. But I have never seen conquerors who fed the hungry children of their enemies. I have never seen victorious warriors who wept when they accidentally damaged civilian homes during battle." Her testimony was supported by dozens of similar accounts. Humans had not just avoided harming civilians. They had actively protected them at great cost to their own military efficiency. They had established food distribution networks, medical clinics, and educational programs for enemy populations during active combat operations. Keth spent the evening reviewing surveillance footage from hegemony sources captured during the battle. The enemy's own recordings showed human behavior that seemed impossible by galactic standards. In one video, a human patrol found a group of starving hegemony soldiers hiding in an abandoned building. Instead of capturing them, the humans left food and medical supplies, then withdrew without making contact. Another recording showed human engineers working to restore power and water service to civilian areas, even while those areas remained under hegemony control. The humans had literally provided aid to populations that were actively supporting enemy forces against them. The final piece of evidence that day came from the hegemony commander's personal log, recovered from his destroyed flagship. Commander Vash Tech had recorded his growing confusion as the siege progressed and human forces consistently chose tactics that prioritized enemy welfare over military advantage. "These humans fight like no species I have encountered," the log entry stated. "They could have ended this siege in days with orbital bombardment, but they refuse to harm our civilian population. They treat our wounded better than we treat our own." They have turned warfare into some kind of moral exercise. I do not understand how such weakness can be so effective in battle. As Keth prepared his notes for the second day, he realized that his investigation was uncovering something far more complex than simple war crimes. The humans had not abandoned military effectiveness. They had achieved victory while maintaining moral standards that seemed impossible in combat situations. They had somehow found a way to wage war without abandoning their principles. But questions remained. How could such compassionate warfare actually succeed against ruthless enemies? Had the hegemony forces taken advantage of human mercy? Tomorrow, Keth would investigate the turning points of the siege to understand how human moral constraints had affected the actual course of battle. The answers would determine whether human warfare represented evolution or a dangerous vulnerability that other species could exploit. The third day of Keth Varan's investigation focused on the siege's critical turning point. According to military records, the battle for New Meridian had reached a stalemate until a single engagement broke hegemony resistance and ended the conflict. What Keth discovered about that engagement would haunt him for the rest of his long life. Colonel Kim led him to the ruins of the Meridian Cultural Center, a massive complex of buildings that had served as the hegemony command headquarters during the final weeks of the siege. The area still showed signs of intense ground combat. Blast craters and debris fields surrounded the main structure, but the building itself remained largely intact. This was their final stronghold, Kim explained as they walked through the rubble-strewn plaza. Commander Vashtek had fortified the complex with his remaining forces. We had them surrounded, but they held a significant tactical advantage. Keth studied the building's position. It sat on elevated ground with clear sight lines in all directions. The approaches were narrow and easily defended. Any direct assault would be costly and time-consuming. Standard galactic military doctrine would call for orbital bombardment to eliminate the position quickly and efficiently. Your fleet had orbital supremacy, Keth observed. A single bombardment run would have ended the siege immediately. Why did you not use it? Quote, well, when to 50C, when to 50C, when to 50C, Kim's expression grew dark. Because of what they did inside. Come. I'll show you. They entered the cultural center through a makeshift entrance cut by human engineers. The interior showed signs of hasty fortification, with barricades and weapon positions throughout the main halls. But as they moved deeper into the complex, Keth began to notice something that made his four stomachs clench with dread. The hegemony forces had filled the building with civilian hostages. Families of human colonists, captured during the early days of the siege, had been placed in strategic locations throughout the command center. Children, elderly humans, and non-combatant workers had been chained to support pillars and weapon emplacements as living shields. Over 3,000 civilians, Kim said quietly. Vashtek announced their presence during his surrender demands. He said any attack on the building would kill innocent humans along with his forces. Under galactic law, their deaths would be considered acceptable casualties for achieving strategic victory. Keth examined the evidence carefully. Forensic analysis showed that the hostages had been systematically placed to maximize casualties from any orbital or artillery attack. The hegemony commander had created an impossible situation where human forces could not achieve victory without slaughtering their own people. What was your response to his demands? Keth asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We refused to negotiate with terrorists, Kim replied. But we also refused to sacrifice innocent lives for military objectives, so we chose the third option. The third option, as Keth learned from examining battle records, had been a direct ground assault on the fortified complex. Human forces had attacked the building level by level, room by room, accepting massive casualties to avoid harming the hostages. The operation had taken 3 days and cost the lives of 847 human soldiers. Keth reviewed the tactical data with growing disbelief. The humans had possessed overwhelming firepower advantage and could have ended the siege in minutes with orbital strikes. Instead, they had chosen to fight the most difficult battle possible, accepting 10-to-1 casualty ratios to preserve enemy civilian lives. The assault records showed acts of heroism that defied rational explanation. Human soldiers had thrown themselves on grenades to protect hostages from blast damage. Engineering teams had worked under fire to cut chains and remove civilians from danger zones before advancing. Medics had prioritized treating wounded hostages over their own injured comrades. Dr. Chen Wei had been part of the medical team during the assault. Her account of the operation revealed the true depth of human moral commitment during combat. "We treated everyone," she told Keth as they stood in the former command room. Human soldiers, hegemony warriors, civilian hostages. It didn't matter. My team lost 6 medics during the assault, but we saved over 200 lives. Some of those lives belonged to enemy soldiers who had been using innocent people as shields just hours before. The most shocking evidence came from hegemony sources. Commander Vashtek's final communication, sent just before his capture, expressed his complete incomprehension of human tactics. "They could have killed us all in moments," the recording stated. "Instead, they are dying to save the lives of beings they should consider enemy collaborators. Their soldiers are advancing through concentrated fire to rescue civilians who mean nothing to their strategic objectives. I do not understand this species. They fight as if victory means nothing compared to preserving life." Keth interviewed hegemony survivors of the assault to verify the human accounts. Their testimony confirmed the impossible. Human forces had repeatedly chosen tactical disadvantage to minimize casualties among both hostages and enemy combatants. In several instances, human soldiers had shielded wounded hegemony warriors from their own supporting fire. A hegemony lieutenant named Korshvel described the moment when human forces breached his position. "They could have thrown grenades into the room, but there were hostages present. Instead, they came through the door one at a time, accepting our fire to protect the civilians. 3 humans died taking that room. They died to save the lives of people whose species they had never seen before the war." The civilian hostages provided the most disturbing testimony of all. They described human soldiers who had comforted frightened children during the assault, medics who had treated their injuries while under fire, and officers who had apologized for the delay in rescuing them from their captors. Sarah Chen, a human civilian who had been held hostage for 6 weeks, spoke to Keth with tears in her eyes. "The soldiers who saved us were just kids themselves, 18 and 19 years old, scared and far from home. But they came for us anyway. They died to save people they had never met and would never see again. I watched a boy from Earth give his life to cut the chains holding my grandfather. He didn't even know my grandfather's name." As the day progressed, Keth realized that he was documenting something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans had achieved strategic victory through tactical methods that should have guaranteed defeat. They had turned a hopeless hostage situation into a successful rescue operation by accepting casualties that no other species would consider acceptable. The final piece of evidence came from analyzing the siege's broader strategic impact. The assault on the cultural center had been broadcast across hegemony communication networks by their own forces. The sight of human soldiers dying to protect enemy civilians had demoralized hegemony resistance throughout the sector. Other raids had surrendered, rather than face an enemy that fought with such incomprehensible moral strength. That evening, as Keth compiled his notes, he struggled to find appropriate terms to describe what he had witnessed. The humans had redefined the concept of military victory. They had proven that moral superiority could be a more powerful weapon than orbital bombardment. They had shown that an enemy's greatest tactical advantage could be turned against them through superior ethical standards. But the cost had been enormous. Nearly 1,000 human soldiers had died in an operation that could have been completed with 0 casualties, using conventional galactic military doctrine. The question that would haunt Keth's remaining days was simple. What kind of species willingly accepts such losses to preserve the lives of beings who had come to destroy them? Keth Varon's fourth day of investigation began with a discovery that would forever change his understanding of moral courage. While reviewing classified hegemony intelligence files captured during the siege, he uncovered evidence of atrocities that justified any retaliation under galactic law. What he learned about human response to these crimes shook him to his core. The files contained detailed records of hegemony research facilities hidden throughout the occupied territories. These laboratories had conducted biological experiments on captured human civilians, testing new weapons and interrogation techniques on living subjects. The documentation was extensive and horrifying, describing torture methods specifically designed to cause maximum psychological trauma to human minds. Dr. Chen Wei accompanied Keth to the largest of these facilities, now converted into a memorial for the victims. The clean white walls could not hide the building's dark history. Examination chambers, surgical suites, and isolation cells told a story of systematic cruelty that exceeded anything in Keth's experience investigating war crimes. "We found this place during the second week of the siege," Dr. Wei explained, as they walked through the memorial. There were still 43 humans alive inside. The hegemony researchers had been using them to test biological weapons designed specifically to target human physiology. Keth examined the medical records carefully. The experiments had been designed not just to gather intelligence, but to inflict maximum suffering. Children had been separated from parents and subjected to psychological torture. Adults had endured surgical procedures without anesthesia. The elderly had been used to test the effects of various toxins on aging human biology. Among the victims had been Dr. Wei's own family. Her husband and 2 children had been captured during the initial hegemony assault on the colony. The records showed that they had suffered for weeks before dying in agony from experimental biological agents. The researchers kept detailed notes. Dr. Wei said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. They documented every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment of suffering. They treated human beings like laboratory animals and recorded it all for future reference. Any species in the galaxy would consider such treatment justification for unlimited retaliation. Under established galactic military law, the humans could have executed every hegemony prisoner, bombarded their worlds, or subjected captured enemies to identical treatment. No court would have questioned such response to documented war crimes. Instead, Keth discovered something that challenged his understanding of justice itself. The humans had captured the research facility's staff alive and treated them according to the same Geneva Conventions that governed all human military conduct. The beings who had tortured human children received medical care, adequate food, and humane detention conditions. Dr. Creshmore, the hegemony scientist who had supervised the biological weapon testing, agreed to speak with Keth. The interview took place in a comfortable detention facility where the war criminal received better treatment than many soldiers got in active service. Creshmore's confusion about human behavior was evident in every word. "They know what I did," the scientist said. His clicking language filtered through a translation device. "They have seen the recordings of my work, read my research notes, found the bodies of their people, yet they give me books to read, allow me to exercise, provide medical care for my arthritis. I do not understand these humans. Any rational species would have killed me slowly and with great pain." Keth questioned the detention facility staff about their treatment of war criminals. The humans maintained the same standards for all prisoners, regardless of their crimes. Guards who had lost family members to hegemony atrocities still provided respectful care for captured researchers and interrogators. Lieutenant Kim Soo-jin, whose sister had died in the biological weapon tests, served as head of prisoner services. Her daily routine included providing medical care and educational programs for the beings who had murdered her family. When Keth asked how she maintained such professionalism, her answer revealed the depth of human moral evolution. "Revenge would be easy," she said simply. "Making them suffer would feel good for a while, but then I would become like them. My sister died believing that humans were better than that. I won't prove her wrong by abandoning our values when they become difficult to maintain." The most disturbing evidence came from human military psychological reports. Soldiers who had discovered the research facilities showed signs of severe trauma and rage. Many had requested permission to execute the captured scientists immediately. Some had required medical intervention to prevent them from taking revenge against prisoners. Yet none had acted on these natural impulses. The human command structure had provided counseling, support, and clear guidelines that maintained moral standards even in the face of ultimate provocation. Officers had faced court-martial for allowing prisoners to receive substandard treatment, even when those prisoners had committed crimes against humanity. Keth reviewed interrogation transcripts where human intelligence officers questioned war criminals about ongoing hegemony operations. The sessions followed strict protocols that prohibited torture, threats, or any form of psychological pressure beyond standard interviewing techniques. Information vital to saving human lives had been gathered through patience and professionalism rather than retaliation. The galaxy's most experienced war crimes investigator found himself documenting something unprecedented: a species that maintained ethical standards when those standards directly contradicted their survival instincts and emotional needs. The humans had proven that moral courage could overcome even the most justified desire for revenge. Dr. Wei took Keth to the new medical research facility built on the site of the former torture center. Human and hegemony scientists now worked together, developing treatments for the biological weapons that had killed her family. The irony was not lost on either of them. "We're using their research data to create antidotes and medical treatments," she explained, as they watched former enemies collaborate on life-saving work. "The knowledge gained from torturing humans will now be used to heal beings throughout the galaxy." Some of the scientists working here are the same ones who conducted the original experiments. A hegemony researcher named Tesh Val approached them in the laboratory. He had been part of the biological weapon program and was now working to develop treatments for his own victims. His rehabilitation represented something impossible under normal concepts of justice. "Dr. Wei has taught me things I never understood," he said, his translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in hegemony language. "She has shown me that knowledge gained through suffering can be transformed into knowledge that prevents suffering. Her people could have executed me for my crimes. Instead, they gave me the chance to spend my remaining years saving lives instead of destroying them." That evening, Keth met with human military chaplains who provided spiritual support for soldiers dealing with the moral complexities of ethical warfare. These religious leaders represented various human faiths, but they shared common principles about the treatment of enemies and the importance of maintaining moral standards during conflict. Chaplain Robert Kim spoke about the psychological toll of fighting a moral war against an immoral enemy. "Our soldiers see terrible things," he explained. "They know what the enemy has done to innocent people, including their own families and friends. The natural human response is anger and revenge. But we teach them that becoming monsters to fight monsters means the monsters have already won." As Keth compiled his notes for the day, he realized that his investigation had revealed something far more disturbing than war crimes. He had documented a species that possessed moral strength beyond anything previously seen in galactic civilization. The humans had faced ultimate provocation and responded with ultimate restraint. They had turned enemies into allies, war criminals into researchers, and hatred into healing. They had proven that ethical standards could be maintained even when doing so required superhuman emotional control and moral courage. The question that now haunted Keth was simple. What did it mean for the galaxy when the newest member species had already evolved beyond the moral limitations that constrained every other known civilization? 3 months after leaving New Meridian, Ambassador Keth Varan stood once again before the crystalline walls of the Galactic Council chambers. The assembly hall was filled with representatives from 200 species, all waiting to hear his report on human military conduct. They expected documentation of war crimes that would justify restricting human expansion in the galaxy. What they received instead would reshape interstellar civilization forever. Keth activated his presentation device and began with the evidence everyone expected to see. Images of destroyed cities, casualty statistics, and battlefield footage filled the massive display screens. The assembled diplomats shifted in their seats, preparing for another routine condemnation of a violent species that had not yet learned civilized warfare. "Honored colleagues," Keth began, "I have completed my investigation of human military conduct during the siege of New Meridian. I have documented extensive evidence of activities that violate every precedent in galactic military history." Murmurs of satisfaction rippled through the assembly. The hegemony representative, Ambassador Vex Kalar, leaned forward with obvious pleasure. The humans had been gaining influence too quickly, and evidence of their barbarism would slow their political advancement. But Keth's next words silenced the chamber. "However, these violations do not represent war crimes as we understand them. Instead, they represent a form of moral evolution that challenges our fundamental assumptions about warfare, justice, and civilization itself." The presentation continued with evidence that confused and disturbed the assembled diplomats. They saw human soldiers dying to protect enemy civilians, medical facilities treating captured torturers with the same care given to human heroes, and reconstruction programs that benefited former enemies more than human colonists. Ambassador Thexmore of the Rigid Coalition was the first to speak. "This makes no sense," his translated voice echoed through the chamber. "No species willingly accepts tactical disadvantage to protect enemy populations. These humans must be hiding their true military conduct." Keth had expected such responses. He presented the hegemony's own intelligence files, captured documentation, and testimony from enemy survivors. Every piece of evidence confirmed the same impossible truth. Humans had maintained ethical standards that exceeded anything seen in galactic civilization. "The humans possess something we lack," Keth explained as he displayed footage of former enemies working alongside their former captors. "They have developed moral principles that override their survival instincts and emotional responses. They wage war while simultaneously working to preserve the possibility of peace." The Zealothi representative stood to address the assembly. "Ambassador Keth Varan, you are suggesting that humans are somehow superior to the rest of us. This is clearly impossible. No species develops such restraint while maintaining military effectiveness." Keth displayed the final piece of evidence. Strategic analysis showing that human moral warfare had proven more effective than conventional tactics. The siege of New Meridian had ended with lower total casualties than any similar operation in galactic history. More importantly, former enemies had become allies instead of bitter resistance movements. "The humans have discovered something we never considered," Keth continued. "They have learned that moral victory is more valuable than military victory. Their enemies surrender not because they fear human weapons, but because they cannot match human principles." The assembly erupted in debates that lasted for hours. Some species dismissed the evidence as elaborate deception. Others argued that human moral standards represented weakness that enemies would eventually exploit. A few suggested that humans were somehow genetically different from other intelligent species. But the evidence was overwhelming. Independent investigations by other species confirmed Keth's findings. The humans had indeed developed forms of warfare that preserved their ethical standards while achieving strategic objectives. They had turned enemies into allies through moral superiority rather than superior firepower. Dr. Chen Wei addressed the assembly through quantum communication from New Meridian. Her presence filled the chamber through holographic projection as she spoke about her work with former hegemony researchers. "You ask how we maintain ethical standards when faced with such provocation." Her translated voice carried clearly through the massive hall. "The answer is simple. We remember that today's enemy can become tomorrow's friend. Every being we spare today might help save lives tomorrow. Every moral choice we make proves that civilization can survive contact with barbarity." The hegemony representative attempted to challenge human credibility by questioning their long-term intentions. "These moral displays could be deception. Ambassador Vex Kalar argued. Perhaps humans are simply more sophisticated in their conquest strategies. Commander Vashtek, the former Hegemony siege commander, appeared via holographic link to address that concern. His testimony carried the weight of someone who had directly experienced human warfare. I led the assault on New Meridian, expecting to face another violent species interested only in territorial expansion, he said. Instead, I encountered beings who treated my wounded soldiers better than my own medics did. They could have eliminated my forces in hours, but they chose tactics that preserved as many lives as possible. No deception is sophisticated enough to maintain such consistency under combat stress. The debate continued for 3 days as species after species struggled to understand the implications of human moral evolution. The evidence was clear, but the consequences were disturbing to civilizations that had accepted warfare as inherently brutal and dehumanizing. Finally, the ancient council representative spoke. The eldest were the galaxy's oldest civilization, survivors of countless wars spanning millions of years. Their perspective carried weight that silenced all other debate. In our long existence, we have seen every form of warfare practiced by intelligent species. The elder's ancient voice resonated through quantum translation. We have witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations. We have never seen what these humans have accomplished. The transformation of warfare into an instrument of moral progress. The final vote was unanimous. The Galactic Council established the Human Protocols, a new framework for interstellar conflict based on the moral standards demonstrated during the siege of New Meridian. Every member species would implement human-style rules of engagement, prisoner treatment standards, and civilian protection requirements. More importantly, humans were invited to establish the Galactic Ethics Commission, an organization responsible for monitoring and enforcing moral standards throughout known space. The species that had been investigated for war crimes became the guardians of galactic morality. Keth's final report concluded with observations that would influence galactic policy for generations. The humans have proven that strength and morality are not opposing forces, he wrote. They have shown us that the greatest military victory is meaningless if it requires abandoning the principles that make civilization worth defending. As he transmitted his final documentation to the Council archives, Keth reflected on what he had witnessed. The humans had not just won a siege, they had won the right to define how advanced civilizations should conduct warfare. They had turned investigation into invitation, suspicion into respect, and moral evolution into galactic revolution. The galaxy would never again accept barbarism as the inevitable price of military success. Thanks to the humans, warfare would become an instrument of moral progress rather than moral degradation. The species that had faced extinction while maintaining their principles had instead become the teachers of species that had survived by abandoning theirs. In the end, the true horror was not what humans did in their war zones. The real horror was what they refused to do, and how that refusal had made them the strongest species the galaxy had ever encountered. Their moral courage had conquered not just their enemies, but the moral limitations that had constrained galactic civilization for millions of years.